To perk up, you gotta percolate. A hot cup of coffee makes the perfect day.
Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing very well. When I said that I hoped that our next episode would be soon, I didn't realize that it would be the following week. We're on a roll. This is a big deal for us.
I came to play.
Yeah, it's not just every other week. Right now, we are doing it every week for a period of time. You and I have sort of mapped out how we want to do our schedule, and we're letting listeners know now that for a little while at least, our show is going to be weekly.
Somebody on Twitter messaged me and said, hey, I've been listening to your Steven Universe episodes. Really fascinated so far. Also, do you have a schedule? Because... Well, they said there's a lot of episodes to cover in Steven Universe. And my answer was, you know what? We don't have a schedule. And also, yes, there are a lot of Steven Universe episodes to cover. Mm-hmm. And I definitely wouldn't say that one message prompted us to sit down and put dates in a calendar. But I think it helped to remind us that we do have a plan for what we're covering next.
That's right. There is a plan, at least part of a plan. We know how we want to cover the next thing that we cover, and so we're going to give folks an opportunity to vote on that very soon. So keep an eye on that, patrons. I'm excited. Let's get into this week's series of episodes because this is where it is happening. The show has truly taken form. As we said at the end of the last episode, I could see where the fans were going. I could see what they were excited about. And I feel like this chunk of episodes, there are 10 of them. For starters, we see our first arc. We see our first multi-episode arc where the consequences of a previous episode carry over into the next. And again, I think we might be seeing a darker side of these gems. I really want to break this down with you. We covered 10 more episodes this time. Starting with episode 21, Joking Victim. Then we moved on to Steven and the Stevens, Monster Buddies, An Indirect Kiss, Mirror Gem, Ocean Gem, and that was the first half season finale. There was a hiatus, and then they came back with House Guest, Space Race, Secret Team, and Island Adventure. Drea, we have discussed Amethyst. We have discussed Pearl. We've still not really talked about Garnet, and I'm not saying that these 10 episodes are going to give us much more. Garnet is the one that seems to be very protective of her personality in terms of analysis. She doesn't give us a whole lot, even in these next 10. But we did get a little bit more with Steven. We got a little bit more with those around Steven, especially some folks in town. And we got a little more with how the gems themselves, the crystal gems themselves, interact with not only one another, but also others like them. Others like them. Yes, others like them. Right off the bat, what was your initial take on these 10 episodes?
We're sort of creating a construct here that I don't see evidenced by any kind of pattern or schedule elsewhere. Like we're just going in groups of 10. Right. So I just want to establish that we're trying to form meaning from these groups of episodes. But I totally agree with you. We actually saw the emergence of several significant powers that Steven Universe has that we didn't know about and that he's learning about. One being the ability to bubble, which
we already, you mean his ability to bubble things, not because we've seen him in a defensive bubble.
Yeah, he's able to like bubble himself, but he is actually able to form a protective bubble around objects. And we think, or at least we believe, that the purpose for that is to collect gems.
Yeah, we got a little more of the lore of the gems.
It has a purpose. There seems to be something lending itself to his heritage, that his mother was also a protective type of crystal gem, and this might have been something she could do. But moreover, we saw that he could heal, something that we definitively know his mother could do. And she could do it through her tears. Steven Universe does it through his saliva. This is a very quirky ability, but happens to be quite powerful. This concept that he can heal wounds, and in particular, he can heal gems. So when there's a crack in a gem, which is essentially the personhood, that's somebody's livelihood, he can restore it and essentially save their lives.
Again, I have to point out the fact that we are learning more and more, and it's really sort of being beaten into us that while the other three are strictly destructive, and by that I mean their crystal gems give them weapons.
Yeah, like they're more offensive.
They are very much on the offensive. Steven is protective, and he is the best of them. He's the one who shows the most humanity, and he's the one who everything you see is a shield. It's a protective bubble. It is a literal shield he forms. He has also been given this ability to heal. It is really great to see the differences between him and the three that he desperately wants to be a part of, but is just always sort of on the outside. There was one thing that you noticed, that he didn't seem to understand jokes, and you instantly said something that perked my ears.
Yeah, I think we have a clip or two of examples of when something is said and Steven Universe takes someone's language or statement very literally.
Yeah, so let's take a listen. Here's the first case.
Maybe I should phone up Lars, tell him he can stay home because I found his replacement.
Really?
Oh, no, that was a joke.
And here is the second case.
Idiot! He's burned me before. Just once, I'd like to burn him back.
I know how to burn people.
Yeah, I think we see it with Sadie. We see it with Connie. I want to argue that these are peers who are around the same age, around the same sort of developmental stage. And the reason that's important is that he will kind of respond to a joke or a statement in a very literal way, and there will be a reaction from one of them. And the reaction is usually like, no, I'm joking, or you took me too seriously. It's this an almost kind of odd mismatch. It's almost as if he is he's coming across as odd to them. He's coming across as not connecting to what they're saying. Like there is this sort of brief social disruption. And I interpret that as potentially being, maybe evidence of him being on the autism spectrum disorder, or having, being someone who is not neurotypical.
Yeah.
Maybe the intention is that Steven Universe is somebody who's supposed to represent neurodiversity, and that the reactions that his peers have are noticeable, but they sort of move on anyway. That doesn't keep them from being friends with him. That doesn't create a huge discord or it may, I mentioned it, it's sort of like a language or communication disruption, but it doesn't disrupt the relationship. And it made me think further about whether there are other things that he might do or other signs, cues that maybe he is meant to be somebody on the autism spectrum.
Say more about that. Like what?
So when we think about autism, and, I want to first start this conversation addressing it as a mental health disorder first, and then talking about why that can be, and that should be explored a little bit further. But when we're thinking about autism as a mental health disorder, there are a number of important key criteria to think about. These like little areas or domains that I suggest people think about.
Okay.
One is that a person with autism usually will lack responsiveness and social reciprocity. So sometimes this looks like someone is aloof or lacks interest in other people. You don't see a ton of empathy expressed, and almost this inability to share attention with others. It's sort of this clear inability to kind of put themselves in another person's shoes and understand that another person might be having an experience alongside them. This is a central feature of autism, this lack of social responsiveness. And when I think about Steven Universe, in some cases, he doesn't seem to be able to perceive other people's perspectives, that he does sometimes lack this sense of otherness. And yet I also understand that he's a kid and he's growing up, and that in many ways could be quite normative. The other thing to think about too is that he's in this really unique situation. He's being raised by crystal gems, which are basically aliens. So there should be a lot of reasons why he doesn't necessarily understand their experience or think about their experience that often.
Yeah,
it's hard to relate to them, right?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I was wondering, can you apply the autistic spectrum to someone who was straight up raised by people who are otherworldly? It's all they know. Yeah. And so they may not understand even human humor quite as much.
Yeah, he might have some neurobiological reason to be he actually is neurodivergent, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's the point. I think Rebecca Sugar has answered some interviews and mentioned that they are absolutely meant to be alien to us, and that there should be some benefit to that we should be exploring how it feels to kind of see that detachment and some of that loneliness and difference. So I think some of that's intended, but I appreciate this is a neurodevelopmental disorder, right? So it's important to think about that as we have this conversation. In talking about the social or lack of social skills or lack of social connectedness, it's important to note that most people with the diagnosis of autism will typically not include others in play. They don't really, again, because they're not necessarily centralizing other people's experiences or thinking about their relationship to others, they have little desire to be interacting with others and even play with others. And that's where we see a lot of difference with Steven. He searches for peers. Like he kind of wants to be social. In fact, I think if he's not socializing with humans, I think sometimes we see him feel sort of down about that.
Yeah.
So that's where we see some differences.
But then he'll also socialize with himself.
He does.
There's an entire
He's
episode.
totally able to just kind of self-entertain.
But then this was one of those cases as well where once you mentioned the autism spectrum, I started to sort of see it in different places, and maybe I was over analyzing. But in the episode Stephen and the Stevens, where it had to be one for the ages for you, where you're dealing with both time travel, you're dealing with multiple different versions of Stephen, but they're all the same person. Which one came first, etc. He goes back in time, stops himself from doing something, but that then creates two of them, and then they go back in time and they do something else, and that creates three of them, and they decide to form a band together. And what I noticed was this absolute rigidity about, well, you had a drummer, you have a bass player, you have a guitarist, and then you have the prime Stephen, who is the singer. But to all of them, they were all the singer in their own timelines. And so they get very upset when he takes center stage, to the point that they then minutes later kick him out of the band. It's this rigidity. I mean, it's a joke about, bands and someone taking the spotlight and then getting kicked out. It's age old, but there is this rigidity that you see with the four of them, where they're each accustomed to a certain thing and it needs to be that way. And even that seemed to sort of shine a light on that spectrum for me. And I didn't know if you felt the same.
That's a great point. And people with autism do display a pretty significant need, this need of rigidity. And they tend to be not just highly rigid, but repetitive in their behaviors and interests and activities. And they do become upset at minor changes in routines, and even in the way that other people might interact with them. There's a phrase that I appreciate a lot because it helps me understand this. It's called the perseveration of sameness. You might be very familiar with this. A perseveration of sameness. It means that, a person is strongly attached to the way environment is, the objects in the room, the way things are arranged. And so someone with autism can become very reactive. They can have strong reactions when minor things are changed in their environment. So that perseveration of sameness may be something that you are picking up with some of Stephen's behaviors. And similarly, people with autism, this is why we might see folks collecting things like objects that they carry with them or that they play with constantly. It's not like, they're being immature or they have to have a safety object or something like that. It's almost this need to have sameness, this need to have routine, repetition, pattern. And it does, according to experts, it has this neurobiological element to it, that these aren't random behaviors, that there is something about their need to relate to the environment in this way. So how we're seeing Stephen react to, I think in a lot of ways, react to some of the other characters, especially Amethyst, may give us a window into whether he has some of these fixations.
Let's talk about those other characters, because in the next episode, there was a moment that everything sort of clicked for me. The next episode being Monster Buddies. And it's one that opens up with Stephen and the other crystal gems fighting against a big ice monster. And they remove one of his arms. And Stephen instantly shouts out, "Your arm!" He's very empathetic, and it makes you. genuinely feel for this monster that you just presume is otherwise terrorizing this location, whether they're destroying things, they're being super destructive, or whatever. You feel like the crystal gems must have a reason for attacking this monster. This monster, by the way, looks like a big ice version of like the Kool-Aid Man. I mean, it's sort of adorable. It's not terrifying by any stretch, but they end up killing the ice monster, and that's sort of when we learn how the crystal gems themselves work, the gemstones themselves. Apparently, each of these monsters is a former gem, similar to the crystal gems that he lives with, that have been corrupted. And their job is to not kill, per se, these monsters. Their jobs are to sort of deactivate them so that they retreat back to their gems, similar to what we saw Amethyst doing when she went back into her gemstone. And then they form this protective bubble around it, which is what you were referring to. And then they keep it basically in a vault, in a sort of another dimension type room in one of Amethyst's, in her room. And really only Garnet is allowed to go in there, we establish. And it's just this room with a lot of floating orbs with gemstones. He pops one of them, and a little, for lack of a better word, a pet, a gemstone that starts out seemingly evil and drooling acid is going to attack him, and he tames that sort of dog-like creature and becomes like best buds with it. And it gets to the point that as soon as the other crystal gems see it, they instantly want to attack it. Now, this is one of those things I want to talk to you about, and that is the rigidity of their mission as well. And it's very possible that, similar to even maybe Batman, they have lost sight of what it means to help these gemstones, these corrupted gems. They really only want to attack them and then imprison them, essentially. Mm-hmm. Because at one point, Pearl even mentions, until we can find a way to help them, this is how they have to stay. I've never seen any of the other crystal gems looking into it in their spare time, how to help the others. And for all I know, it's possible all it needs is a little of Steven's spit. Who knows if they pop the protective bubbles, maybe he can lick the other gems and they'll get better. But we're not even 100% sure that's what they want to do, because in an episode a couple of episodes later called Mirror Gem, he is given what he thinks is a broken mirror that's meant to show him things, the history. It's a mirror that is able to record anything it sees. And so it basically gives him the history of the crystal gems, but it's not working properly. Pearl keeps trying to get it to work, and it's not showing them what she's asking for. So she assumes it's broken. And Steven goes off, and it turns out this thing starts to talk to him using almost sound bites. It's almost like remixing things that he has said or done in order to communicate back with him. And it turns out he is communicating with another crystal gem.
She's been stuck.
Yeah.
She's been trapped in that mirror. But as you mentioned that, I realized looking back on that episode that he is, we learned a couple things. Mm-hmm. We learned that he doesn't go to school.
That's true.
Because his friend was saying it's almost like summer break. And he's like, well, what is that? And he urges Pearl to kind of like teach him, and they both kind of get off track with this mirror. But through the mirror, we realize that he is pretty, he's pretty connected to this concept of friendship. Mm-hmm. That in many ways, I would say, there's some elements that make him seem odd. There's some elements that makes him a little quirky about it, but he's absolutely interested in connecting with, whether it's a person in a mirror,
Yeah.
whether it's Onion, who we still haven't figured out, whether it's this little pet, this little gem pet that he's discovered. He is wanting to relate to others. So we're building more and more evidence that he has some odd behaviors. He has some interesting social behaviors. And if anything is maybe lacking he's not in school, so he might be lacking the opportunities for social skills that would make him more developmentally appropriate. But yeah, I'm appreciating all the nuances of his personality and his developmental features through his way of connecting.
Now, what about their personalities and what we're learning more and more about them, how militant they are about these orbs, especially when it comes to what we eventually learn is Lapis Lazuli, the character who's in the mirror, who's this other beautiful crystal gem whose gem is on her back, and she seems to be able to control the water. Mm-hmm. And I'm fascinated by their reaction to learning that not only was there a crystal gem trapped inside this mirror, she was supposed to be. It was their mission to keep her there. And at the end of the episode, she goes off into the ocean, and they are really, really concerned about that.
Yeah.
And in the follow-up episode, this is the beginning of the first arc that we have really gotten from Steven Universe, called Ocean Gem. We learned that she has taken all of the ocean away, and she has basically stacked all of the world's oceans up on top of one another in the effort of getting off of Earth and going back home. So we now realize that there is a broader universe in the Steven Universe mythology. There is a home. There is another planet that is a home to them. And it's very possible that a significant number of these gems that are so-called corrupt simply don't want to be here. And these 3 gems that are remaining have maybe imprisoned them on Earth, because when Lapis does finally get off of Earth and Steven heals her cracked gem, and she gets wings and she flies off. I want to play this one little moment. It's the very end of this episode where a couple of the crystal gems may not know what this means. Take a listen.
So, Lapis made it off planet.
What does this mean for us?
We wait and see.
This is where I understood, well, there's a lot of things we realize. There are other gems, and that their home is on a different planet, which, we learned through a series of episodes that there is a particular planet that they call home. Mm-hmm. And no, this particular gem, this crystal gem, there doesn't seem to be a good reason to keep her trapped in a mirror on a tiny town on Earth. Mm-hmm. I'm sure we will learn why later. And it could be that like you're saying, that the crystal gems are, that their mission is on its surface one way, but could potentially be much deeper. There could be much more depth to what they're doing. I don't know that there's a darker side to the gems. I hear what you're saying. I'm seeing this as there's more to their story, and that what they're doing probably has some motivation that would make sense to us as we get to know them better. But as you were talking about this new gem we discovered, I realized that Steven's super interesting and super cute, super wholesome. But as we begin to learn about the other gems, the story isn't really about him as much.
No.
And in other words, when I'm looking at how we're relating to these concepts, especially around neurodiversity, I wonder if it's the gems. If I think about, for instance, Amethyst, that we've talked about her hyperactivity. We've talked about her inability to stay focused on something. And I've even mentioned that it bothers me that she's sort of sloppy, right? And what we're seeing could be a manifestation in a gem way, because, right, they're not human, but in a gem way, is this a manifestation of being understimulated? Like someone who has ADHD or someone who is on the autism spectrum disorder, one of these neurodiverse identities, that maybe she is just not stimulated enough in her environment, in her surroundings, that her brain is looking for stimulation. And so this is why she's kind of jumping from one thing to another. Pearl, on the other hand, is constantly fixated on sameness and organization. And we talked about her in the last episode. And I wonder, this is another potential example of a feature of the autism spectrum. She is showing potentially, maybe she's overstimulated, that there's too much noise, that she's processing. And that for her to find calmness, she is having to keep herself busy on these special sort of these interests. And that kind of makes sense, just in terms of how we're relating to her. Similarly, and she makes people mad. People don't like Pearl a lot of the times because she's so rigid and so upset when things aren't the same. Yeah. And so in a way, I'm not saying each of these characters has autism. I'm saying,
and Garnet is got that monotone thing,
Yeah,
and
no,
not
great
a
example.
Not
She's not
flat personality.
She's not callous. She doesn't have that sort of emotional responsiveness that we might be looking for. Really good example. So we're seeing these features of neurodiversity across these characters, and with this new character, this sense of almost a sense of anger, a sense of some strong emotional reactions.
But I would be that way too if you trapped me in a mirror and used me as your tool without any sort of. I mean, I almost got her reaction as sort of a vindictive. It wasn't so much her personality. I don't think that was her personality, because she seems to be very kind, at least to Steven, especially there at the end. She gets very defensive when he comes to talk to her, because she assumes that he is similar to his three sister-like companions. But then in the end, when he heals her, she basically just thanks him and she leaves. I just didn't get any malevolence out of her. It's almost like she's the antithesis of the other three. She's the one who had the emotions and maybe just wasn't like the other crystal gems. But you might be onto something about the other 3/4.
Yeah, in a way, back in the day when we were talking about Batman, the animated series, of course, often we would be focusing on Batman, but we would realize that it's the characters around him that would become interesting to us because they were fallible, because they had experiences of hardship and trauma, because they were in sort of more interactive with their environment. And of course, because they're villains and they're rogues, they were causing trouble. So we would often kind of bring our attention to those characters and talk a lot about those characters in some ways, especially as they're relating to Batman. I think there's a similar thing happening where the show is about Steven Universe, and yet the characters we're relating to, the characters that are grabbing our attention and helping us understand psychology better, are the characters that are around him. And as I pointed out they're aliens. So I think clearly the show is trying to message to us what are you learning about elements of otherness? What are you learning about in terms of differences? And especially in this conversation, what is this telling you in regards to neurodiversity?
I'm not going to let Pearl get off the hook, though, without talking about the next episode, which was Space Race, where she becomes obsessed with this notion of building a spaceship using all the junk in their immediate surroundings. And she succeeds. She creates a spaceship that is meant to take them back to her home planet. And she becomes so obsessed with this notion of showing Steven sort of, quote unquote, where he's from, this idea, which really you get the sense that it's more she wants to go back, that she puts him at great risk. I mean, this spaceship is falling apart as it's leaving Earth's atmosphere, and she insists on continuing, that we can make it. Trust me, we can make it. And Steven is rightly so freaking out. And his father is freaking out because she basically kidnaps him when she talks about taking this ship out for a test, and that it's going to be a 50-year trip. That man will be dead by the time Steven returns. And she doesn't seem to care. Again, this is one of those cases of like the crystal gems not caring about the people of Earth. They seem to only care about the Earth itself. And she insists on Steven coming with, and it nearly gets him killed. Talk a little bit about that. What did you see in this episode? Because for me, it was troubling.
It was troubling, and I think you're right that there's a fixation on a particular task. I mean, in this case, a whole space mission that Pearl has. And it's not as if she's she's malicious about it. It's not as if she wants to be reckless and doesn't care if Steven dies in the ship. Because I think his father says you could explode, or one of them says that the ship could explode in midair. Mm-hmm. And it isn't until Steven tells Pearl the reasons, he explains why he has to go back to Earth. Mm-hmm. And he explains that they need to turn around. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard concept for her, because it means, I think in her mind, she holds this perfectionistic schema. Like, don't give up. Yeah. Stay on task. You can't make mistakes. You are 100% in this.
Yeah, and this implies failure.
Yeah, and she can't fail. So he has to appeal to her senses. He has to appeal to her compassion. Let me tell you that this is more risky for me. We have to go back. You have to turn back. It also means that Pearl has to give up this dream that she has to go back and be ostensibly with others like her and be in a place where she belongs. Because I think we're getting a sense that she feels very othered and very different.
Yeah.
In Beach Town.
Yeah.
Beach Town?
Beach City. I think.
Beach City. So it's an emotional scene, but it's one that's strong for Steven. Again, showing that he appeals to her emotions, and that's a skill. I think that we're seeing some strengths in him, his ability to understand her. And I think what's really quite strong about that scene is that I do think that she feels seen. I think that she feels that he understands why she's doing what she's doing.
Yeah. And then finally, there are two characters that have been seen several times in the past that we've certainly gotten a lot more out of in this chunk of 10, which is Sadie and Lars from The Big Donut. They are very clearly in a bad relationship.
It's complicated.
It is complicated, but I get the sense that this is one of those adult themes that has made its way into the series that maybe fans have grabbed hold of, because Sadie is virtually abused, emotionally in this relationship. We see several episodes in this chunk of 10 that focus more on her sort of doting on him and Lars just simply not reciprocating. And it doesn't end well, especially at the end of the final episode that we watched, Island Adventure. We'll talk more about those two as the series progresses, I'm sure. So stay tuned. But right now, I would say that is a relationship that is destined for failure.
And is Sadie 35?
Is Sadie 35? I have no idea. I mean, she strikes me as like a teen. Well, I mean, what? Are you reading something that says she's 35?
She seems like she's 35.
She seems older and more mature than Lars for sure. But I don't know. I'm placing them a little ahead of Steven, but I really don't know how old they are. Clearly, Lars is emotionally a child, though.
Lars seems more of a peer, or like a slightly older peer to Steven.
And got to be a redhead.
Of course.
Yeah. So, Drea, what did you think of these 10 episodes?
This group of episodes, I think this is my favorite group of episodes. I know we're probably about halfway through season 1, but I'd say that these were really enjoyable. And you're right. I think we're seeing some more mature and sophisticated elements and themes come up. We're getting to know Steven a little bit more, and we're seeing his powers emerge. Mm-hmm. And I think that journey is really fascinating. I think what's more interesting is how we're seeing the crystal gems as these figures in his life, and potentially representing features of the audience, like features of people or experiences and identities of people who are watching the show, mm-hmm. and feeling like they're relating to it, feeling like these stories are for them, feeling like they can see themselves in the narrative, which is really, really important.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned neurodiversity a little bit during this episode, and I think it's important to just embrace some of the categories we've been talking about, whether we're talking about ADHD or autism, and referring to these patterns or these features, and in some ways a sense of identity for people. And I want to acknowledge that, as a psychologist, I have to say these categories come from the psychiatric and psychological fields, that these are categories of mental illness. But there's some helpful distinctions here. A mental illness such as, let's say, severe mental illness, schizophrenia, major depression, and some other illnesses that are associated with suffering. Mm-hmm. In many ways, people who live with autism and ADHD do not experience suffering. And this has been a distinction that psychologists need to give space for. And I think people are pretty aware that there are advocacy groups, especially for autism and for the autistic community, that give some light to these different areas of discussion, including the possibility that autism isn't necessarily an illness, isn't necessarily something that parents should be disappointed in if they learn that their child has it or been diagnosed with it. And there's a ton of controversy right now pointing to Autism Speaks, a particular organization that claims to be an advocacy group that continues to pathologize and give really damaging, harmful language to autism.
Oh, really? Like an actual quote unquote advocate?
Yeah, because again, they're relying on the medical model in framing their support for autism. So they use language like grief and loss when they're talking about supporting parents who have learned that their child has autism, right? So it's very deficit oriented. Autism Speaks has also been an organization that has had very delayed responses and accountability just in terms of embracing the diversity within the autism community and really kind of being in alignment with humane and community-based definitions. We on the show have often talked about this concept of person-first language when we talk about people with mental health disorders. So we would say, someone with depression, a person with schizophrenia, a person with an anxiety disorder, and so forth. The autism community there's a lot of controversy about language, but language is so important. And so Autism Speaks put a lot of spotlight on this concept because it had a very outdated and harmful reaction to how language is used. They only recently started saying, going back to what's called identity first language, saying autistic person or autistic people instead of people with autism. I often say, because people ask me about this, try to ask the person what they prefer. But it is true that a lot of people in the autistic community do prefer identity first language. I'm autistic. Say I'm an autistic person. It's not an ailment. It's not a deficit. It's not a disorder. That's me. I can totally respect that, right? And I can totally see how the community wants to have ownership and just a level of involvement in who gets to define what. Now I've gone on a tangent, but the reason I bring this up is that our podcast is really centered around Western medicine and psychiatric and psychological models that are about pathology. So this show in particular really gives us a bigger lens here, right? Yeah, we're talking about mental health, but we're also talking about the potential that these characters in Steven Universe are manifestations or representations of neurodiverse identities. And now we get to be in their stories and talk about their stories more. So in that way, we benefit a lot from this show.
So it's a really good way of saying you enjoyed these 10 episodes.
A lot to think about, a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
And certainly this won't be our last conversation. I think this is one of our first lengthy conversations about autism, but it's not going to be our last conversation, given that the show seems to have some of these themes embedded in its storytelling.
Love it. Drea, until next time, why don't you tell folks where they can find you online?
You can find me online on my website, drdreapsychology.com. I'm also on Twitter at ArkhamAsylumDoc and on Instagram with the same handle.
You can find me on Twitter at bward028. You can find me on Instagram at b_ward028. You can find us both at Arkham Sessions on Twitter and at the Arkham Sessions on Instagram. And of course, you can find us on Facebook. Go and follow our friends over at Fanbase Press, who are always kind enough to share our podcast out to the world. And until next time, I want to thank our patrons, Leslie Brownlee, Christopher Bauer, Michael Pruitt, Isaiah Atchin, Ian Stanton, Eric O'Sullivan, Zachary Hunter, Dr. Girlfriend, Verdigree, Maria Diego, John Henry, Dr. Jerome Anderson, our good friend Todd Stashwick, Samir Bhakta, and of course my father, Carl Ward. Till next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
Stay cool forever, Steven. Mwah. Arrivederci.